And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Okay, guys, so I'm gonna do something a little different tonight. I'm gonna talk about, well, let me let me put it this way. A story. I was in the car the other day and I was driving around town running some errands and I stopped off at Panda Express to get some lunch. I was in a hurry. And I decided to park the car up at the lake at the reservoir here in town where I live. Beautiful sight of the water of the lake while I get to have my lunch. And I put on the radio, just your local soft rock, soft pop station that I like, a lot of music that I like, and from like the 80s and 90s. I'm an old guy. I like all that old stuff. And Madonna's Papa Don't Preach came on. If you guys remember that song from 1986 from the True Blue album. It was a big hit at the time, for those of you who remember that are old like me. And the song was really controversial in some ways at the time, had a really catchy tune to it. Now, in my house, Madonna is verboten. My wife just won't allow it to be played in my house because um, the nature of what Madonna is and what she represents and the damage she has done to her culture and society with her influence over young ladies. And I think every new generation has a Madonna, right? From the Lady Gagas and the you know Taylor Swifts that all do their damage in many ways to young ladies from a social, cultural, and moral perspective. But Madonna was the big one in the 80s when I was growing up, of course, and remembering back to the Like a Virgin premiere in 1983 and some of the social ramifications that had, and her look and her sort of her appeal to sexuality and how that affected everybody really, but young ladies especially, because I believe that Madonna was not only designed to ill affect young ladies, but in my opinion, her ilk was always designed to affect Catholic young ladies, right? And you're gonna kind of see that here in the video that I'm gonna play. I'm gonna keep the sound off on the video. The sound doesn't come through very well, but still that allows me to comment on it. And everything that Madonna has been, especially from the standpoint that she's always kind of represented herself as this what do you want to call it, lost sheep Catholic girl, kind of in a way, Italian as well too. To me, that's always been interesting because I think what we see in Hollywood and music industry is a particular targeting of a lot of different groups. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Catholics are exclusive, but Catholics have always been the primary target because of the sort of the moral laws that Catholics have always kind of held fast to. I think other groups like Protestants who have been more malleable in morality have not been as directly attacked. Don't get me wrong, they have in a lot of ways. Like for example, in the movie Footloose, I think that was targeting more like evangelical types of Protestants. I get that, but Protestantism is fundamentally different because through the idea of sola scriptura, their morality is subjective because their theology is subjective, right? But in the case of Madonna, I think she was clearly sort of that Italian Catholic schoolgirl thing that you see early on that was there to push buttons and to push sort of the immorality of the time. And it's interesting because, like I said, by the time we get to the 1980s, this is the full fruition of the sexual revolution playing out. And if you read the sort of the description biography of the song on Wikipedia, I know Wikipedia is not the best source, but I'm just taking it there. It doesn't seem to be anything controversial about this in the sense that it was a reaction to our times. It was a reaction to the rumors of this girl at school getting pregnant, that girl at school getting pregnant. And it really was an epidemic at the time that was happening in the 80s in my time when I was in grammar school. It was always a girl that was getting pregnant every few months and then had to leave school or quit school or whatever else to raise this child. And it was, again, that byproduct of the sexual revolution kind of rolling down the hill, going back to at least the 1960s, if not a little earlier than that. We can debate when the sexual revolution started. But my point has always been by the time we get to the 1980s, it's the full collapse is starting. I believe the full collapse culminates in the 90s and then, of course, in the first decade of the 2000s. But by the 80s, we're in that transitional period where it's kind of kept underground, right? And I believe why it's kept kind of hidden and on the low end where there was still some sense of shame and blame while it was happening out of sight is because our grandparents' generation was still alive. Let's call it that greatest generation, right? That we always talk about, that still held on to the faith and certain moral principles. And I think a lot of us didn't want to bring shame and blame to the family. But once that greatest generation era of our grandparents' generation begins to die off, by the time you get into the 90s, well, that was kind of the last bastion of protection. Because remember, the greatest generation gave birth to the baby boomers. And the baby boomers began to fall. Not that everybody fell to sort of the whims of the sexual revolution in the 60s, but many of them did. And I think there was an inherent contradiction between what the baby boomers were going to teach their kids and how they govern their lives and whether they can uphold a more traditional standard when the baby boom generation began to already rebel against sort of that greatest generation, which went back, a generation earlier, obviously. And so that's why I say by the time we get to the 90s and that greatest generation era begins to die off, I believe the last elements of sort of public morality begin to break down. But in the 80s, it was underground, right? We were all trying to hide it in many ways. But the likes of Madonna in Hollywood and the cabal there, I believe, of satanic nature, is pushing buttons, pushing social issues, and using music in Hollywood to normalize a lot of these behaviors and ultimately make it acceptable. And so in the case of Papa Don't Preach, obviously this is a situation where girls are getting pregnant out of wedlock, and how do you deal with that in that era of sort of history? Especially when the girls are dropping out of school, and it's becoming, in some ways, a crisis within society, right? As we see today, that crisis has come full circle because we have a pandemic of illegitimacy and broken families now that really culminates really in the 70s and the 80s is kind of where it just starts to take off, precisely because of the sexual mores or the breakdown of the mores of the 60s. And so I think there's a lot of factors here. I think there's a social factor. I also believe there's an economic factor here. And I'll play the video here in a minute here, and we could see it in a way where, it kind of gives us some hints about where the culture was at the time. And so, but economically, I think too, what it was is as the usury system began to go full blown, in debt, putting people perpetually in debt by the 70s and 80s, I think the other factor nobody talks about is not just the sexual morality that's a problem. I think economics plays a big role here in the sense that I think many people are already becoming overwhelmed with the usury system. And I think for women at that time, apart from the morality that has collapsed by that point, I think for a woman to get pregnant and ultimately to be financially rewarded by the government does play a role in this. Remember what I said, that cultural Marxism is only a part of the problem in regards to the degrading culture of our time. I believe it's been actually capitalism in some ways that has been used in order to help facilitate the collapse of the family as well too. And you see that in many various ways, right? As Marxism is brought in deeper forms, government takes more control. It robs the ability of individuals and families to take care of themselves. Government subsidizes in some ways, right? Sort of this immoral behavior. It makes it easy for young ladies to drop out of school, especially where we're at an impressionable age where maybe we don't want to be in school because many kids reject that. I mean, this is a lot different than, the old days. You're 13, 14 years old. You might have stopped your education, went and worked on the farm. You learned your trade. You were being productive. By the time you're 16, 17, 18, you can get married. Well, in this current modern sort of usury economy, we have stretched out childhood long and further than probably, then there's a natural calling in many respects. And I think this is part of the problem that we see today and why we in many ways, we've made a bunch of weak generations through usury, right? Where we extend childhood out into the 20s, mid 20s now, and into the 30s as people are always going to school. Well, some people naturally reject that, right? Whether it's our biological functions that are calling us to, to reproduce, or our passions have been enamored by media, then the music industry, and all this the sexuality that society is drenched with now. I think many young ladies decided to opt out, have a child, thinking maybe at first this is a good thing. This guy will probably marry me if I get pregnant by him. Or guess what? If he doesn't, I'll go collect the welfare check. I think that's a real thing. And I think it's a Marxist tactic to destroy the family just as much as all these sort of the social factors and the immorality that has been brought in through liberalism, right? So I mean, that's just a long-winded kind of idea that I'm having here. But let's get to the video here. Let's talk about the video, what Madonna is trying to portray here. And I'll comment as played. Remember, no sound here, just the video. Now, listen, I'm gonna warn you guys, there's parts of this music video where Madonna is kind of shaking it, right? I think compared to today's sort of what we see in the media today, it's actually kind of mild, but just be prepared for that. Maybe I'll skip ahead on that stuff, okay? Here we go. All right. So New York City here, obviously. What do we got? We're portraying their 1980s, the girls, the boys hanging out. This belonged before social media. Here comes Madonna. First thing I notice is very masculine dressed, in my opinion. The haircut, the jeans, the shirt, leather jacket. I mean, that's a greaser kind of a look from the 60s is what I'm seeing here, right? Now, the song itself is about this character that Madonna plays, a young girl that gets pregnant as a teenager, and then having to break the news to her father and how she was going to do that and the fear that she had. Here you see the imagery. If you don't recognize this actor, that's the actor. The last name is Aiello. He played the gas man in Dumb and Dumber, if you guys ever watched Dumb and Dumber. But here, obviously, it shows a relationship between father and daughter, sort of the innocence of this relationship. And here's the boy now, right? Here's the boy that she falls with. Look at that. Okay, let me stop right here. Okay. So you got the boy, got this greaser look. And I find that fascinating, the greaser look, because if you remember something like, what was it? The Outsiders, starring Ralph Macchio, right? You have this war in the 1950s between the greasers and the socials, right? And what that always represented to me is that the socials were kind of white, blonde. They kind of portrayed that Anglo-Protestant kind of successful group in America, where the socials were the guys, they were the outcasts, they were the greasers with darker hair. They represented something more like, in my opinion, what Italians would look like, right? Or what Hispanics would look like, those of a darker complexion. And so you have a cultural rift there between an Anglo-Protestant group and what, to me, seems like a minority group. And of course, these two groups go to war with each other in movies like The Outsiders and all those days of the 1950s, when immigration and Protestants were kind of hammering it out in the culture at the time, right? Obviously, immigration was needed because America needed, especially Italians, to help build the infrastructure, because Protestants were already contracepting at the time. And with that brought a lots of social disorganization between the different groups in society as America is becoming that melting pot. But notice her shirt here with Madonna, right? She looks at the kid walking by that she's fallen in love with. He's kind of got this greaser look with the slick back hair, kind of, and he's got the blue jeans, things of that nature. And then she's got the shirt here that says, Italians do it better. Now I find that interesting, of course, in Italian, because Madonna has always played up that Italian thing, while at the same time combining that with lots of anti-Catholic rhetoric, especially in her music. If you remember her other video, Like a Prayer, that some say was a blasphemous act, which looks like a blasphemous act with me, when a figure comes down from the crucifix and they start making out. In the 80s, it was a big deal. We've all forgotten about that now. But Madonna has always played this, especially in the 80s, this kind of Catholic schoolgirl thing, man. She's always used that, right? She says she's Italian. She comes from Italian heritage, and she must be multi-generational Italian at that point. And I've told you guys before, this is what happens in America when you're a byproduct of immigration. Once you're here 2 and 3 generations, first goes the language, then goes the culture, then goes the faith. Madonna, in many ways, plays up this lost kind of Catholic schoolgirl thing where she's rejected the faith to be more modern and more open to sexuality, things of that nature. And so it's interesting that she wears that in this video, because listen, I know with all the global apostasy that we have today, not only in America, but Europe, but Italy especially as well too. People say, well, it's all apostatizing. But in the 80s, I still think there's a case to be made today, but in the 80s especially, Italians and Catholicism were symbiotic, right? To be Italian was to be Catholic, and to be Catholic was to be Italian in Italy back in the 80s. And so to me, this might as well say, hey, this is the Catholic schoolgirl routine, right? The Italian Catholic schoolgirl routine, who, guess what? I'm going to start to break barriers from my ancestors and the rules that my father set and the rules that our faith set, right? We're going to break the rules here because I'm in love. I'm pursuing my passions. I'm pursuing sort of my sexual inclinations. And it's time to get away from those fuddy-duddies, old school rules, and morality that our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents used to believe in, right? And so this is a direct shot at, I believe, in my interpretation as an Italian, a direct shot at the Catholic faith, right? So there's the boy, right? Kind of greased back hair, blue eyes. She's kind of falling from there, right? Here's Madonna shaking her stuff. Let me skip forward a little bit here. I don't want to see that. All right. So here's the boy here at the grease pit. Typical, stereotypical, the Socia, right, versus the greasers from the 1950s, right? He probably didn't go to school because the Anglo Protestants were the intelligent ones. They were the bankers. They were the highly educated ones. They were the ones that had high status in those days, right? In the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And the immigrants were kind of the everyday workers, right? The laborers of the day, right? That's why Italians came over here, right? Is to work, right? There's Madonna shaking it again. Once again, okay, Madonna, skip forward here. All right. Now there she's serving her daddy. She's thinking about, okay, I'm pregnant. How am I going to tell my dad? Because I know this is going to break his heart, right? She kind of looks up a little bit. Daddy's looking at her. They're washing dishes. She's thinking about when's the best time to break it to daddy. Daddy's taking a nap. She's out in the town having fun with the greaser. Most likely portraying another Italian boy is what I would imagine, multi-generational, right? Italian boy that has embraced kind of this hybrid Americanization Italian thing that starts to happen. Oh, so they're a loving couple, right? They love each other. It looks like they're going to have a future together. Never mind that most often these are one-hit wonders in the sense of it's a sexual experience that doesn't go further, especially because they're kids, right? Especially a lot of boys that are not conditioned to take care of families or not able in this usury economy, right? That's why a lot of these girls wind up not being with the father of their children when they get pregnant at this age during that era, right? Because nobody was ready to raise a family. We pushed out the ability for everyday men to work, get jobs right away, push everybody into college, which means we're pushing back sort of our sexual tensions in our society. And of course, contraception and abortion become a norm in order to deal with a society that's looking to push education further and further out. And with that, also sort of adolescence as well, too. So here's Madonna walking up the street. Let's see what she does here. Going back home. She's done told daddy. Maybe she's about to do it right here, I think, right? Ah, she's telling daddy. Look at daddy. Look at the daddy's upset. Do you blame him? Do you blame him? No, does she deserve an ass whooping at that point? That's my question. I don't know. Now, in those days, there's different factors, right? How these things will be handled. A lot of girls were sent away out of town because of the shame, things of that nature, right? And some people say how cruel that was in those days when you sent, these young ladies away to a convent or you send them to family across the country. But that was shame and blame. There was also a way to control this stuff, right? Because in many ways, with infatuation, that's a difficult passion to control at the end of the day. And you don't want a bunch of young ladies who have had their libidos inspired, and it's okay to do this behavior because you're going to get a bunch of government checks anyways. Do you want effectively what we've become? And that is a broken society through a broken family through mass illegitimacy. That's what those standards of old were trying to protect. Today, in our sort of world with liberal sensibilities, we see that, oh, look at what they did. They were ashamed of them. They sent them away. How cruel was it? Well, that was a society trying to deal with the real problem of sex and biology and the nature of sexual revolution that was coming down the pipe without passing law after law after law after law. Now we're just a society, a liberal society, where we legislate everything. And then we complain about losing our freedoms. Well, there's ways that society can handle these social dysfunctions, right? By implementing acts of shame and blame. Of course, it helps when you have an authority, an arbiter of truth behind the shame and blame, when you have a church in place, right? But of course, we're Americans. We don't have anything like that. We got freedom and liberty. And as I said in one of my more recent casts, right, this sort of contradiction in American society between freedom and license, something that has never been rectified, right? The left has taken everything to its natural, sort of, immoral end, while the right is always struggling to define, okay, we believe in traditional values, but how do we maintain them without trouncing on freedom, right? And what they found out is you can't. You need a social structure. You need social mores. And with that, you need certain standards that need to be enforced. This is why the right has never been able to stop this perpetual tilt to the left, culturally and politically in America. And so here we have Daddy. Here's the end of the video. He thinks about it. He's upset, but he basically accepts it. What's he going to do, right? Daughter's pregnant, doesn't want to lose daughter. He's going to be a granddaddy. It's not a perfect situation. There's going to be some shame there in the 1980s when the neighbors found out or when the other relatives found out, because in many ways, when a daughter gets pregnant out of wedlock, it's a sign of failure in many ways of the parent, right? And so, and listen, it's one of these things where I think as parents, we've all been, and I'm a parent, right? And there's lots of fears. There's, that this could happen to any one of us. Obviously, I think the more the faith is practiced in the home, the less likely these things are to happen. And I think by the 1980s, the faith is breaking down because we're all being liberalized, right? In this new, mosh pit, if you want to call it that, of Americanization. And so I think a lot of parents in those days gave up because they were already being overwhelmed by the culture that was just, re-educating, indoctrinating, brainwashing their kids, right? From television to MTV, the porn industry was becoming mainstream in homes at the time, magazines, Hollywood movies, all of it, right? And even the government, who doesn't teach sort of traditional morality, winds up sort of codifying a lot of these social disorders by legislating and facilitating laws to help facilitate the immorality, like in the case of funding women that get pregnant out of wedlock, right? It encourages it in many ways. And so when the entire culture has collapsed, your neighbors to your left and your neighbors to your right have all apostatized, and there's nobody left to reinforce sort of the Catholic values or the Christian values that you believe in. I do believe that parents get overwhelmed because then the parents are stuck looking like, boy, are really a bunch of fuddy-duddies. And there's many parents that are brave enough to tackle that as best they can. I know I have, with my kids and best they can, but there's many people that are not built for this constant warfare against sort of traditional values that liberal society has sort of bombarded us with over the past, really since the Enlightenment, 200 years. And I think many parents just gave up. And I think it was always going to be almost impossible in a liberal society where true faith, true religion, the sacramental life was not in place to reassure and reinforce the spiritual strength that we need to overcome a lot of the moral degradation, especially something as intrinsic as our sexual drive, right? This is why these pagan societies, whether you look at the Roman Empire or what have you, always had this sexual license that played sort of within the realm of that society. Only a Christian society, a true Christian society devoted to the sacramental life and the greater structures of society being dictated under the tenets of Christendom had a chance to maintain, sort of control our fallen nature and that passion, that sexual libido that we all struggle with in many ways. Never mind bringing all these people from various different cultures into one mosh pit or melting pot, whatever you want to call it, and then say, okay, now let's be good morally based on these, dictates of the Judeo-Christian values, right? Which is nothing more than a concoction of post-World War II liberalism to try and pretend like we're still a Christian nation in America. And so you can understand why many parents began to accept this in some ways. I don't think it was right. But eventually the entire culture accepts it as well too. And once the culture accepts it, you break down the tenets of shame and blame. Well, then it's a floodgate. This is why now living out of wedlock is normal. Shacking up out of wedlock is normal. Children out of wedlock is normal, right? Illegitimacy is the norm now. And once all this kind of goes through time and space, the dysfunctions and disorders without true religion, true catechesis in the faith being taught, practicing the sacramental life that enforces and strengthens our soul to be able to fight this fallen nature. Well, one generation after another misses out on that. And they're left on their own in this fallen world. And you wonder why we have the moral debauchery of our time. It's all been laid out for us. Whether you want to go back to the 60s or the 20s, the sexual revolution brought in by liberal societies under the tenets of freedom, liberty, right? And individual rights, it's all collapsed in us. It's helped facilitate the collapse of the culture and ultimately the collapse of the family and the collapse of all the political systems around us. It's why the world makes no sense anymore. It's why the world seems broken and lost. And there's no election coming to save us, right? At this point, there just isn't. Madonna just picked up on this early on. I think for her, it was just a byproduct of trying to show the world this happens. You got to accept it. Let's all be kind, right? This is why daddy at the end is hugging her rather than sending her off, right? Acceptance, right? Where else do we see these kinds of acceptance? Well, we see this acceptance in the LGBT lifestyle now. We see this acceptance in the transgender lifestyle now, right? And all these nefarious kind of sexual these sexual sins that ultimately have consumed society. And that's the ultimate point. Get everybody around you to accept it, right? Get everybody to surrender morality. And ultimately, when you do that, you change religion itself. First, you change the culture, and then you create religion that accommodates those sins through acceptance, right? Because we're not fighting against it. You don't want to be a meanie poo-poo head, right? And you want your neighbors to accept you. You want your family to accept you, right? I've seen this a lot lately in the past decade or so with the LGBT issue, where parents who may reject their child going into this lifestyle in and of itself being a struggle. It's your neighbors or your family and friends now that come down on the parents and say, no, you're wrong for not accepting it. This is the new morality of a pagan society that we have created, because inherently America was never truly Christian, right? We had this religious indifferentism at the founding. It was Protestant at the founding. And as I told you so many times before, the founding of America and its Protestant nature was always destined to get us where we're at today, right? Because Protestantism always devolves. It's why Protestantism has never created great civilizations, unlike the Catholics, where Catholics have created the greatest civilization in the history of the world, which we call the West. And then when everything begins to break down and we have all this moral crisis, Protestantism breaks down, is taking the Catholics with them at this point in time. We try and codify behind this general idea of Judeo-Christian values as a last desperate attempt to protect the political narrative of classical liberals who have lost all of the West at this point in history through Enlightenment ideas and through liberalism, right? So there you have it. You know, for Madonna, I think it's just simply the point to continue to urinate on her ancestral roots, if she is in fact Italian and comes from a Catholic bloodline at some point, because that's who Madonna is. Again, you see that much more bolder later on in Like a Prayer, her video Like a Prayer, and other songs that she did, along with pushing a sexual license, right? She did a movie, a documentary in the 80s as well, too. What was it called? Truth or Dare, right? Where she expresses her, opens up about her sexual libido, let's put it that way, to expose young ladies to continue to normalize that this is okay for young ladies to sleep around. So in one sense, here's Madonna making a video saying, okay, we got to be kind and compassionate and understanding. On the other hand, it's also Madonna that's pushing the ideas and the sexual revolution in her own right, in her music, that gets young ladies in this position, right? She is the destroyer. And of course, she has the answer to all your problems. She creates the problems and she solves your problems. That's what liberalism always does, right? And Madonna exemplifies this in a perfect way here in her life, in her music, but particularly in this video, Papa Don't Preach. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The Catholic schoolgirl routine always used to destroy Catholics, to at least mock Catholics in the mainstream media, ultimately in Hollywood, music, all of that stuff. We've always been under attack. We always will be under attack. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.